Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Lexie Smyth. I'm one of the campaign managers here at Barnes& Noble, and with me today is Frontlist Buyer Brenda Allison. We are thrilled to be in conversation with Jennifer Haigh, author of our April Book Club selection, Rabbit Moon. If you sent in questions via the Eventbrite, Brenda and I have them. You can also submit questions via the Q&A module, which Brenda and I will be monitoring. As a reminder, this is a conversation with spoilers. If you haven't finished the book, you can always come back later as this will be posted on the Barnes& Noble YouTube channel. All right, let's get started. Let's talk about the book.
So, Jennifer, thank you for being here. The Shanghai of Rabbit Moon is so vivid that it's a character itself. I understand you had a fellowship with the Shanghai Writers Association and spent time there writing the book. Did you know you were going to write about Shanghai while you were there? Tell us about your time there and how it influenced the book.
No, honestly, it was a complete surprise. So I was awarded this fellowship in the summer of 2016. And at that time, I had already started working on my last book, Mercy Street. So my intention was to just continue working on that book while in Shanghai. It's what I always do when I travel. I'm always in the middle of a novel, and it's usually pretty portable, and I can pick up my work wherever I go. In Shanghai, I discovered very quickly that this was not going to be possible. This was my first time traveling in China. It was my first experience of an Asian megacity. I was unprepared for how impossible it would be to ignore my surroundings, which is kind of what I do when I'm writing. You know, when I'm at home in Boston, I hole up in a writing studio, I wear earplugs, over which I wear those earmuffs that construction workers wear, and I have a white noise machine, and I'm very intent on blocking out my surroundings. I could not replicate that in Shanghai, and honestly, I didn't want to. I was completely blown away by the experience of being in this city. It lit up my brain in a way no place ever has. And so it was very clear to me right from the get that if I'm going to write anything during my months here, I'm going to have to write a story set in Shanghai because I don't want to block it out. In fact, I don't want to pretend I'm back in Boston. So I wanted to just embrace my surroundings and see what happened while I was there. So I had 3 months with no responsibilities, really. It was an amazing opportunity. I was one of 10 foreign writers who were there living in the same apartment building in Shanghai. It was a tall apartment tower in the old French concession, a wonderful part of the city. And I had my own apartment on a high floor, two doors down from a hair salon. And in fact, I didn't know this going there, but this is typical of buildings in China where you have a mix of residential units and businesses on every floor of an apartment tower. So on the 23rd floor, my neighbor was a hair salon, and I became very fascinated with the comings and goings of people from this salon, including one young man in particular, whom readers will recognize. He was a very beautiful, sort of androgynous young Chinese man, probably in his early 20s. I saw him every day in the elevator, outside on the sidewalk, smoking cigarettes. And he was the spark that led me to write the Johnny Dew character.
Yeah.
Now, my normal process when I'm writing a novel involves a lot of research. So, had I been writing at home in Boston, I would have contrived some way to have a conversation with this guy and ask him some questions. There was no way I could do that because I do not speak Chinese. And I just had to go purely on imagination in a way that I wouldn't normally allow myself to do. So I invented a whole backstory for Johnny Dew. I still have no idea whether this is anywhere close to this young man's life story. I don't know the first thing about him. But that was my version of Johnny's past, Johnny's family, where he came from, what he's all about. So he was maybe the first character that came to mind.
I love that so much. Thank you for sharing that with us. In my opinion, the heart of Rabbit Moon really is the relationship between the sisters, Grace and Lindsay. It really struck me that it was Grace who is away at summer camp, who is the first person to realize that something's wrong with Lindsay. And I would love to hear a little bit about how you wrote this relationship.
I love the Grace character. I have a particular tenderness for her, and this always happens to me when I write a character from childhood into adulthood. And I've done that several times in my novels, and I find I have a different relationship to the character as an adult if I knew her as a child. So when we first meet Grace in the novel, she's 11 years old. She's at summer camp in New Hampshire. She knows something's wrong, but she feels cut off from her family. Her parents have gone to China, and she's isolated, and she's even had her phone taken away at camp. So she has no way to keep in touch with her sister Lindsay, with whom she's very close. It was striking to me that as fractured as this family is, that the one relationship that is healthy and intact is the relationship between the sisters. And so even though Lindsay is estranged from her parents, barely keeps in touch with them, is lying to them about what she's up to in Shanghai, she never loses touch with her sister Grace until until this accident happens. And by horrible coincidence, it is right around the time Grace's phone is confiscated at camp. So it's a full week before she realizes that Lindsay isn't texting her. And that has never happened in Grace's memory, for her sister just not to be in touch. So by the time she gets her phone back, it's been a week since she's heard from Lindsay. And she fully gets that this is not normal. Um, Writing the story of these two sisters was interesting to me because it's in no way a given that sisters with that kind of age difference, 11-year age difference, it's not a given that they're going to be close. And on top of that, Grace is adopted. So, they're very different people, Grace and Lindsay. It's entirely possible to imagine a situation where they're not close to each other, but they are extremely close. The Grace strand of the story, in a weird way, pre-existed the rest of it. It pre-existed my trip to Shanghai. For a lot of years, I've been interested in this question of international adoption, specifically all these girl infants who were adopted from China in the late 90s, early 2000s. My interest in that comes from my own experience. I have close family members and close friends who've adopted daughters from China. So I've gotten to see a couple different iterations about how these international adoptions can play out. And it was interesting for me to write my own version of it, how international adoption plays out in one particular family.
You talked a lot about the connections between the characters. The characters in this novel are so interconnected, different levels, different people. There's a theme of the seeming randomness of those connections versus how our lives are actually changed by these random meetings. There's a quote from May and Lindsay's meeting that struck me. The novel says, statistically speaking, every meeting is improbable. Statistically speaking, May and Lindsay shouldn't have met anywhere, and yet here they were on a Saturday afternoon in the springtime, sitting one table apart in a tourist bar near the Bund. Tell us about your thoughts on the randomness of our encounters with others and how we build stories and meaning from them in our own lives.
I think about that a lot when I'm writing novels because as the novelist, you make certain choices. You put characters in each other's paths. And it makes me think about my own life and how random it is that I met my husband, that I met my best friend, that my parents met each other for that matter. And all of our lives are built on these series of intersections that might not have happened. So in that scene, it's the beginning of the second part of the book. It's a flashback a year ago, Lindsay's first visit to Shanghai. So she has been living in Beijing with her American boyfriend. They've been working teaching English, and they go to Shanghai for a weekend to check it out. And they go into this bar and they have a fight. And her boyfriend Zach storms out, and Lindsay strikes up a conversation with a woman at the next table who is May. And I thought a lot about this in the writing of it. What if they had gone into the bar next door, Lindsay and Zach? She would not have met May. She might have met somebody else. And everything in her life from that moment forward would have been different. And it's true in all of our lives, but when you're writing a novel, you're making those accidental connections happen. So, I am choosing to put these characters in each other's paths.
It's interesting when we finally meet Lindsay and Grace's parents, Aaron and Claire. They've been divorced for a few years, and we find out why later in the book. Um, but I'd love for you to tell us a bit about how you wrote each of them and why things are still so acrimonious between Claire and Aaron.
Well, Claire and Aaron's divorce is pretty recent. When the novel opens, they've been divorced for 3 years, and they really have not been in the same room much since that happened. So the last time they were together was when they drove Lindsay to the airport, Lindsay and Zach to the airport to fly to Beijing. So that's the last time Claire and Aaron were in the car together. But since their divorce, Claire has stayed in their house in Boston. Aaron has moved to New York. They don't deal with each other unless they absolutely have to. Once in a while there's a phone call, but they've not confronted each other in quite a while. I love writing about divorce. It's a thing of mine. I've written a lot of divorce characters, and what I find interesting about it is when you're writing about a divorced couple, even if you're not writing about what went wrong, you're always writing about what went wrong
Mhm.
because it is always present. It's always in the air between Aaron and Claire. One of the great pleasures for me of writing novels is writing from different characters' points of view, sometimes the same series of events remembered by different characters. And it's kind of like Thanksgiving dinner with your adult siblings. If you tell a story from childhood, no two people recall that episode in exactly the same way. And it's like that when writing a novel, that different characters bring their biases and their judgments and their agendas to the way they remember things. Um, when I'm writing from a point of view, it really is, and I've thought a lot about this, it's kind of an exercise in loyalty for me as a writer. When I'm writing from Claire's point of view, I found myself so exasperated by Aaron. Everything about him grated on me. And it's very critical of him and very annoyed by him. And then when I was writing from Aaron's point of view, I was like, oh God, Claire is impossible. How could anybody have been married to Claire all those years? And so I kind of have to take each character's side at the moment I'm writing from their point of view, even knowing that in a few days I'll be writing a different section from someone else's point of view and it will all look very different. So that's something that I have done really in all of my novels, that kind of alternating point of view where you take different characters' side.
It's really wonderful that you do that. It adds a real depth to the novel. Something I also really love is the way you wrote about motherhood in this book, particularly talking about Claire's relationship with her daughters, her relationship to Lindsay versus her relationship to Grace. I found it really striking that Claire found it easier to be a good mother to Grace than it was to be a good mother to Lindsay. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about why you think that is.
Mm. Mothers and daughters are so interesting to me. I'm very close to my own mother. We always have been close. But I do remember that when I was Lindsay's age, in my early 20s, I was really tough on my mother. I was very critical of her. I judged her so harshly. And looking back on it, my mother was the better parent. I mean, I love my dad too, but my mother did most of the parenting. She did all the heavy lifting. She was far more present in my life. She did all the work. But I kind of gave my dad a pass, and I really held my mother to task. And that relationship, that dynamic exists between Lindsay and her parents, that she's really tough on Claire and more forgiving of Aaron. That kind of tension in the mother-daughter relationship goes both ways also, because Claire is also critical of Lindsay, I think in a way that is not uncommon. Claire's like a lot of mothers, and that she's so aware of the wrong turns in her own life, and she wants her daughter to be better, to learn from her mistakes, not fall into the same pitfalls she did. But it doesn't work that way. I mean, anybody who's ever been a young woman, you're not going to learn from your mother's mistakes. You don't want to. You're going to make your own mistakes. And so there is that kind of inherent tension between Lindsay and Claire on both sides. They're critical of each other. They each want the other to be better. With Claire, part of the complexity is that there's a real physical resemblance between the mother and daughter. And so Lindsay looks like her, and Lindsay reminds her of the things about herself that she would like to change, and what she views as her own mistakes and her wrong turns in life. Grace, it's a whole other thing because Grace looks nothing like her. Grace is adopted. And so she is more able to see Grace as her own person rather than an extension of herself. So she kind of gives Grace a little more space to just figure out who she is and be who she is. And that's been much harder for her to do with Lindsay.
We talked a little bit about Grace and Lindsay being really close, but the rest of the family is all pretty estranged from one another. And it's revealed that Lindsay's involvement with Dean, an older male friend of the family, is kind of that inciting incident that led to the shattering of this family. Can you tell us a bit about how it resulted in the end of Claire and Aaron's marriage?
Oh, it's so Lindsay gets into this sexual relationship with this man who's far too old for her. He's married. He's a friend of the family. He's actually the father of Grace's best friend, her little friend Iris. So it is all kinds of transgressive for him to have gotten involved with this young daughter of family friends. And it messes with Lindsay. It does. And I think that's unfortunately not so uncommon. When I was pretty young, I got involved with a man who was too old for me. I wasn't as young as Lindsay was. And it wasn't complicated. He wasn't married. It wasn't complicated in some of those ways, but it still messed with me. It's still, I was in over my head in a kind of adult relationship I wasn't ready for. And so that's some of what I was drawing on in writing that Lindsay Dean relationship. That I did not understand how young I was. I only began to really understand it when I got to be the age that man was when we were involved. Then I was like, oh my, what was he thinking? I could no more imagine myself in a love affair with a teenager than I can imagine myself bursting into flame. Like it's unimaginable. And yet there he was, a man in middle age who was interested in me, a teenager. And I did not fully grasp how completely messed up that was at the time. It was only as I got older. So I'm writing this Lindsay Dean relationship. It really was the moment when the train jumped the tracks in this family. It was very bad for Lizzie. It was very damaging. And her parents, Claire and Aaron, did not agree on how to handle this thing that had happened. I mean, Claire was in a rage, and she felt that this was, that Dean Farrell was a predator, that he'd gotten involved with this 16-year-old girl. She saw him as someone who was preying on a child and wanted to throw the book at him and create any kind of havoc she could for him. And Aaron's perspective was entirely different. He really looked at it in legal terms. Well, in Massachusetts, the age of consent is 16. It really is, by the way, which I find kind of mind-blowing. And so from Aaron's point of view, well, what could you do? It wasn't as if you could press charges. There was no legal action that could be taken. So his way of handling it was to go over Claire's head and behind her back and have this kind of man-to-man conversation with Dean Farrell. And from Aaron's point of view, that solved the problem because it ended the relationship. From Claire's point of view, this did not in any way solve the problem. And in fact, it was a betrayal, and she viewed it as a betrayal that she would never forgive. And so that was the beginning of the end of their marriage. It wasn't just the fact that their daughter had gotten into this disastrous relationship, but it was Aaron's kind of heavy-handed way of handling it. without consulting her. It wasn't something that they worked through together. He decided he was going to deal with this on his own. And that was the breach that Claire could never forgive.
And both Aaron and Claire, you talked about how they react differently. And what struck me was how they struggle with this illusion of control over their children's lives. Claire kind of blames herself. Hey, if I'd never met Dean at the playground, whereas Aaron just blames Dean. So can you talk about how these ideas of control and how they react to this situation really reflects both their personalities and their beliefs about themselves and the world at large?
Well, I mean, this having control of your children, that is part of parenting in a way. I mean, it's hard for me to judge either of them too harshly for having the feeling it necessary to do that and wanting to do something about this situation that Lindsay was in. Um, you also see them, as parents making decisions about Grace and having this daughter who was adopted from China. They both recognize, I think to their credit, that she has been cut off from her cultural heritage. She's been cut off from her birth family. And both Claire and Aaron, when Grace is small, um, really want her to have a chance to learn the Chinese language. They arrange for her to have a language tutor. They arrange for her to have calligraphy lessons and go to Chinese dance classes. And Grace wants nothing to do with this, actually. As a child, she kind of digs in her heels and says, no, I don't want to do that. It's actually it's something that makes her angry, and it's hurtful to her that her parents wanting her to do these things, to learn Chinese. And from her point of view as a child, it's insisting on her difference from them. It makes, it's like her parents just are so insistent about this, and why are they like that, and why is this so important to them? So it's a hard thing for her to understand as a child. An interesting consequence of that, though, is that it's the beginning of her older sister's fascination with China. Actually, it's Lindsay who goes with Claire when they adopt Grace from the orphanage. Aaron is traveling on business, so Claire goes and takes Lindsay, who is like a preteen at the time. So that's Lindsay's first experience with China. It's her first encounter with the Chinese language, and after that, she develops this like full-blown obsession with China. And Grace doesn't want the language tutor, but Lindy says, "Okay, I'll do it." So she has a Chinese tutor and takes Chinese classes in school, and so she kind of she benefits from all these opportunities to know about Chinese culture that Grace flatly refuses and doesn't want. So this question of, parental control, there's an upside and a downside to it. I mean, these are parents who are really trying to do right by their kids in all sorts of ways. And sometimes they nail it and sometimes they get it wrong, but that's parenthood. I mean, they are well-intentioned parents. They both of them.
I think something that was really interesting to me in the book is that while it was Aaron who confronted Dean about the relationship with Lindsay, it's really Claire and Lindsay's relationship that is impacted. And we talked a little, you got into this a little bit earlier, but I think it's interesting that Lindsay assumes it was her mother and not her father who confronted Dean. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about why that might be. And also, it just feels like this situation is really hard for the whole family to communicate openly around. And I'd love your thoughts on why that is.
Well, I mean, every family has sort of different unspoken rules about talking about sex between parents and children. And Claire and Aaron are pretty open about sexuality in general with their kids. And when Claire found Lindsay's birth control pills, had Lindsay been dating a boy her own age, it would not have been a problem. So it's not as if this is a family that is so repressed and so uptight about sex that they just couldn't deal with their teenage daughter being sexually active. That wasn't it at all. It really was the fact that she's involved with a man who is old enough to be her father, who is married, who's a family friend, that they've been sneaking around doing this for months. It's really that. And I think any parent would find that an extremely challenging situation and deeply disturbing and upsetting. Um, so, that's part of the complication of talking about it. It's so beyond the pale. It's not just simply dealing with your adolescent's sexuality. This is a much more extreme example of that, and something that I think no parent would really be prepared for. When I was writing it, it, I was very aware of the irony that the hardest part of this for Lindsay was that Dean Farrell didn't even bother to break up with her. He just cut her off. He just ghosted her. And that was the direct result of her father, Aaron, confronting him. And that's what Aaron insisted Dean Farrell do. That no, you can't see her, you can't talk to her, no, you can't even see her and explain what's happening. No, just that's the end. No more contact ever again. And that to Lindsay was the most damaging part of all of this, was that she never got to have that conversation with Dean about why he disappeared from her life. And that was not her mother's fault. That was her father's idea and his insistence. He made it so. And yet, Lindsay assumes that that's because of her mother, that somehow it's her mother's fault that Dean Farrell disappeared from her life and ghosted her, and that she never got to say goodbye to him. And which is completely wrong, but it is emblematic of the way Lindsay interacts with both her parents, that kind of holding her mother to higher standard, giving her father a pass. And in this case, I mean, it's a real, Claire feels the injustice of this, that somehow, although Aaron's relationship with his daughter has been damaged, it's still somewhat functional, but her relationship with Lindsay has been much more damaged, because Lindsay makes these certain assumptions that this was her mother's doing. So it's the irony of all of that is so very painful. And when I was writing it, I felt for all of them. I
Mm.
truly did. I felt for Claire and for Aaron, and I deeply felt for Lindsay.
I really felt for this family,
Mhm.
and in this whole section of the book, there's a part where it's discussed how Lindsay does sort of prefer her father to her mother because she feels like he needs less from her. And
Which is true. In fact, she's not wrong about that.
I'd
It
love to
is
hear you
true.
talk more about that, and why that impacts their relationship so much.
Claire is someone who has thrown her whole life into raising her children. Aaron is a workaholic. He is running this company that he started. He has always had a much more exterior facing life. Whereas Claire does not have a career. Her career has been motherhood, and her daughters are front and center in her life. She's somebody who was an aspiring writer in her younger years and has sort of given up on that, although she's conflicted about it and really anguished about not writing. Fundamentally, her life's work has been raising her daughters. So, you know, I think Lindsay assesses rightly that her father is just not as focused on her every minute of every day as her mother is. And that's true. That is absolutely true. Aaron travels all the time for business. He's got a lot of irons in the fire. And Claire has two irons, and they are named Lindsay and Grace.
Something that was also very interesting to me was that as Lindsay got older, she starts to have these more complicated feelings about Grace's adoption. She even goes so far as to describe her mother as a white savior. And I'm wondering if you think this characterization of Claire is fair.
It's hard. It's when I think of myself at Lindsay's age, early 20s, the world seemed in some ways morally simpler than it does to me now in middle age. And I think I was much quicker to pass judgment on anybody, and feel that right and wrong were very clear and cut and dried. And Lindsay has some of that judgmental quality that I myself had as a young person. And I don't mean to say every young person has that, but I think it's not uncommon. When you think about the YA books we grow up on, it's very clear who are the good guys and the bad guys. And so we kind of get this moral education that simplifies things. And so, Lindsay is quick to pass judgment on her mother, and I mean, she's not without reason. It is true that there are lots and lots of girl infants, these Chinese infants, who were given up not because they were not wanted children, but because there was this one-child policy that meant that a family got one shot at having a child. And because of the, certain kind of bedrock beliefs in Chinese culture, a son has a lot of value in a family. It's not to say daughters don't have value, but if you are only allowed to have one child, and if you have a choice, many, many Chinese families did choose, if I only get one kid, well, I have to have a son. And that is sort of that kind of value is deeply baked into culture. And so a lot of these girl babies were given up for adoption, including the older sister of Johnny Dew. And that's one of the first things we learn about him when we meet him early in the book, that his family is one of those families who had a first child that was a daughter, and his mother's thought about this is that, well, they have to give this daughter up for adoption because her husband's family would never forgive her their one chance for a grandchild wasted on a girl. So it's not even her feeling, it's what she believes her in-laws feel about this. And it is something that she suffers over for the rest of her life. Johnny's mother continues to grieve this daughter that she gave up 25 years ago. So it is a sorrow that she has carried her entire adult life. And I think there are, countless examples of this, of Chinese parents who gave up a daughter not because this child was not wanted and loved. And so, that is a real part of the story. Grace's birth mother, who gave her up,
Mm.
marked her with a cigarette on the back of her neck, burned her infant daughter with a cigarette so she could identify this baby in this life or the next. And when you think about that, it is heartbreaking that this was clearly a woman who loved this baby and would have liked to keep this baby. But for reasons we don't know, we're not privy to, this was not possible. We know that she was very poor. She felt that she had to give up this baby, but it was a painful, painful thing to do so. So, so Lindsay's judgment of Claire really has to do with that too. Her awareness that, wow, this birth mother probably didn't want to give up Grace, and what a terrible thing that we took her baby away from her. So, it's not that Lindsay's judgment is completely without reason, but it is unfair in some basic way. Um, so yeah, that's all part of the mother-daughter complexity between Lindsay and Claire, and it's a tragic thing that they never get to resolve any of this. And had Lindsay had more years, she might have grown past some of this, some judgment of her mother. They might have worked through some of this anger over Dean Farrell, and they might have had a much closer and better relationship if they'd had more time.
You talked a little bit about everyone's relationship to Lindsay and how that changed them. I want to talk about, you talked at the very beginning as one of the first characters in the books. I want to talk about Johnny and Lindsay's friendship. And that friendship really, there's a lot of parallels between their lives. The friendship really sustains the two of them in Shanghai. I would love for you to tell us a little bit about how you wrote their bond.
Mm. Well, Johnny and Lindsay do have an awful lot in common. One of the things they share is that they're both lying to their parents. You know, um, Lindsay has this entire hidden life, her life in Shanghai. She hasn't even told her parents she moved to Shanghai. And that's a big move. Shanghai and Beijing are not close to each other. They're 800 miles apart. It's like there's a moment where Aaron says, that would be like Claire moving from Boston to Chicago. Like it's that big a move. It's a huge move. And Lindsay did this move and never told her parents about it. She has never told them the kind of work she is doing in Shanghai. They know absolutely nothing about her life. Johnny similarly has lied to his parents about the kind of work he's doing. He has led them to believe he has a girlfriend. And this has been a story that he didn't just tell them once, but has a pretense that he has kept up for more than a year. They ask about his girlfriend in Shanghai, and he gives them, invents a few little details. And, Johnny is gay and does not feel he can tell his parents this, particularly his father. And he has invented this whole, you know, alternate life to comfort his parents. And it's not so different from what Lindsay is doing, letting her parents continue to believe that she's teaching English in Beijing.
Right. I want to talk about the last section of the book. The tone of the book really shifts, and it's told from Grace's perspective.
Yeah.
What made you choose to write it that way?
It's so funny to talk about this as a choice. Rabbit Moon is my eighth book. And when I think back on novels that I wrote some years ago, I don't remember making any of those choices. When I think about it now, I think I just wrote down what happened, which is kind of nuts because none of it happened. In fact, I made it all up. They're all pure fiction. I invented it all. But over time, when I've lived with the characters for a long time, I sort of forget that. And I feel like I'm just writing down a story that I've heard or something that I've witnessed or events that I know have happened in my own family, say. So the choice to write about Grace as an adult, certainly it's a choice, but I don't now remember making the choice. It just seemed inevitable and necessary. When I'm writing a novel, I don't ever make an outline. I don't plan ahead what's going to happen. So I'm as surprised as anybody by some of the stories, by some of the turns the story takes. Um, After my first novel, I tried writing in a more organized way. Writing a novel is really hard. It takes a long time. And I thought, okay, for my second novel, I'm going to be more efficient about this. I'm really going to plan it out. I'm going to make a detailed outline. And then all I have to do is just execute my plan. So I did. I spent, I don't know, 2 or 3 months writing a very detailed outline. It was a good outline, by the way. I'm just going to say that. But you know what? I never wrote the book. Was so, by that point, I'd answered all the questions. I had no curiosity about what happens next. It's kind of like when you're reading a book and your friend has already read it and they spoil the ending for you. And then you've like, okay, I don't need to read the rest. Like you spoiled it for me. That's how it was for me to make an outline of a novel. Because I realize I write novels the same way I read them. I want to find out what happens next. That's the thing that spurs me on. What happens next? And when I'm writing a novel, there's no way to know what happens next until I write it. Whereas if I made it an outline and knew every movement of the story and how it all ends, I think I'd lose interest. So I discovered this final section in Grace's point of view. I discovered it in the process of writing it. I truly did not know that was going to happen. But after Lindsay's death, I write the sort of consequences of her death, like the immediate after effects, how it affects Aaron and Claire and Grace being told. And so I wrote this kind of immediate consequences, but I realized what I wanted to know as a writer is what I would want to know as a reader. Well, what did happen to Grace? Like, how did her life turn out? And it feels to me that's what novels are for. It's for looking at how people's lives turn out. So I wanted to know how Grace's lives turned out. And so to meet her as a grown woman, to learn that she has become a scientist, that she has fallen in love and gotten married, that she has finally made a trip to China and tried to piece together what her sister Lindsay was doing there. All of that. Those were discoveries I made in the process of writing, including her having dinner with Peter Muir at the end and Peter's brand new wife. And that was a surprise to me in the writing of it. I did not see that coming.
I didn't either.
I was like, I was also surprised.
And is that Hester? That's Hester.
It is.
Right? Yeah.
And sometimes I find that there are characters that I start out as being kind of side characters, secondary characters, but I get very interested in and involved
Hmm.
in. And Hester was one of those characters. She was really interesting to me, and I didn't feel like I was done with her, and I wanted to know what happened to her too. Um, so yeah, all those were discoveries I made in the process of writing.
I love that so much. Something that I also found very interesting was Grace's reaction to the Red Thread girls, especially given how complicated Lindsay's feelings were about Grace's adoption. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about why Grace reacts to them the way she does.
Well, I think it's just not something she's ready to confront. She's still, when she meets the Red Thread girls, she is in college, so it's her first time away from home, and she's still a kid in some ways. And so her childhood resistance to learning Chinese, to, learning about Chinese culture, she's still carrying that to some degree. So on some level, she doesn't really want to be adopted. She loves her parents, she loves her sister. She does not want to have any other family besides Aaron and Claire and Lindsay. She's somewhat in denial about it, and she's just not ready to go there. It takes her some years to get there. And when she finally does go to China for the first time, it is a profound experience. It's
Hmm.
life-changing. And, she has this thought that when she is in China, she has never felt more American in her entire life. And this is someone who, when she was a kid and in high school, she didn't have Chinese friends. Her classmates were overwhelmingly white. Her friends were white kids, and so she always felt somewhat different, somewhat other, when she was growing up in the suburbs. And then going to China and being surrounded for the first time in her life by people who look like her, it's complicated. It's on the one hand, it's deeply it's moving to her, it's powerful to her. It's also scary in a way because she's so been defined always as being different, and that's how she's thought of herself. That suddenly to be in a place where everyone looks like her, she kind of loses it for a minute. Like it's really like, who am I? It changes the way she thinks of herself. Interestingly, though, when she comes back to the US, it's the first time in her life she starts to feel Chinese.
Hmm.
And it is a radical shift for her. It changes the way she sees herself. And it is telling that when she does finally fall in love with someone, she falls in love with a Chinese woman. She doesn't, and she is always, so Grace is gay, and as she is coming to terms with being gay, she's always been attracted to white girls because that's who was around. Those were her classmates, those were her friends, her beautiful older sister. She was surrounded by white girls. That's who she was attracted to. And after that experience of going to China for the first time, when she really falls in love hard, it is very significant. And it's almost like she's embracing a part of herself that she is no longer conflicted about. And it's a powerful thing for her.
So we are coming up on time. So just a few more questions as we wrap up. I want to talk a little bit more about Grace's revolution, Grace's discovery of herself when she's in Shanghai. She talks about she describes some women as swans, and she always thought it was just like the wealthy white women that she grew up with. But they were other women of other races as well. There were Chinese swans just as well as white swans. But she knows she wasn't one, no matter where she was. And she knows she's lucky not to be one. But of course, we're always longing to be something we may not be. Can you tell us a little bit about these complicated feelings Grace has
Oh,
about
yeah.
herself?
Yeah. I mean, this is so central to this novel. And it's really it is a kind of a core truth in this novel that being a physically very beautiful young woman is a dangerous thing. And it has been for Lindsay. This disastrous relationship she got into with this much older man had, had everything to do with being so physically stunning. And it got her a kind of male attention that she wasn't prepared for and didn't know how to process. And this kind of attention from older men. And this does happen. Wow, it happens all the time. And it has been really, truly damaging for her. And so Grace, when, as a teenager, as a young woman, she does not have a lot of physical self-confidence. She doesn't feel beautiful. She envies other girls she thinks are beautiful. But she also realizes that being beautiful was not a great thing for her sister ultimately. And her life would have turned out happier and better if she were not quite so physically stunning. And it's a thought that Claire has about
Mhm.
Lindsay too. Early in the book, when after the accident, Claire and Aaron get on a plane, fly to Shanghai, and Claire is sitting at Lindsay's bedside, and Lindsay's unconscious. And Claire has this thought, her daughter is beautiful, the best and worst thing that can happen to a girl. And it was far better to be just pretty, as Claire is. So Lindsay resembles her mother in many ways, but Lindsay's 6 feet tall, and she's like, I mean, she's a whole other order of attractive, and Claire feels protective of her and has already seen what danger this has put Lindsay in. So this whole question of female beauty and what it means and what it doesn't mean and how it changes the life of the person who is blessed or cursed with it. Um, and you see three different iterations of this. Claire is pretty but not beautiful. And she has the thought it freed her up to do other things, that she was not so bombarded with male attention that it freed her to do other things. And Lindsay was not so lucky in Claire's estimation because she was so stunningly beautiful. And Grace, who has kind of carried these insecurities through her whole life about her physical appearance, comes to this conclusion after she learns what has happened to her sister, like that, that the outcomes are better to just be a regular looking person.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, but the question I always like to close these out with is what, if anything, that we haven't discussed, that we have discussed, would you want your readers to take away from Rabbit Moon?
Mm, I mean, I think that the novel really did in the end become a meditation on chance and on consequences. And that kind of that there's a line at the end of the book. It is Grace's thought. She thinks, we exist at the intersection of causality and chance. And and that is very much what was driving me in the writing of this story. This recognition is that we have agency, we have free will, we make our own choices, but that range of choices is determined by stuff that is chance, like the random chance of being supermodel beautiful like Lindsay.
Hmm.
That is just chance. That's mathematics. That's nothing she did or didn't do. That's just the luck of the draw. And so much of what happens in our lives is that it's like dealing with the randomness and trying to find agency within the parameters that we do control. So that's what was driving me when I was writing this.
That is so wonderful. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today and for such a lovely conversation. Thank you to all of the book club readers who joined us today. Come back and see us on May 23rd when we'll discuss this month's book club selection. See you all then. Thank you again, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Have
Thank
a good
you.
day, everyone.